Hello, I'm going to discuss with you the part of 1899 Constitution regarding the religious freedom. But before I proceed, let me first read the written report. I start. The separation of church and state is the most controversial issue when it was crafted. It won by a merely single vote only. To this day, we don't yet have a satisfactory explanation for it. During the debate, it was found divisive because the two contenders were moved by conflicting goals of national community. One side, which is the proponent of church-state unity, championed the Filipinization of the Catholic Church, while the opposing side, while the opposing contender sidestepped it. As the debate continues to heat, Aguinaldo acted on it out of political expediency, but to no avail. The issue continues to linger until the American colonizers came and settled it. They resolved the issue, the Filipino elites can't. In the end, they imposed the separation of church and state without Filipinization. Let me expound this more, little by little, in a very detailed way possible. Alright? Theoretically, the separation of church and state is often seen as a structural concomitant of the spread of rationalization, the rise of religious pluralism, and the growing dominance of the state in social life. Although the separation of church and state has often been seen as part of a simple linear development, this view is ahistorical. The multiplicity of different arrangements and their relations between church and state around the world, from a situation in which the state is subject to religious authority or theocracy, to a state with an official religion which is protected, supported, and or controlled in variable ways, to friendly, indifferent, or hostile separation, suggests that these relations change and evolve in ways specific to the historical dynamics of particular social formations. In the Philippines, the late 19th century provided a complex set of conditions that made a debate on this issue possible, specifically in the context of the Malolos Congress. However, as we will be shown later, the separation of church and state eventually occurred not as the outcome of an autochthonous process of structural social change, but as an imposition by an imperial power. Malolos provided the venue for this singular debate in Philippine history. The arguments advanced by both sides that we will discuss later on. And as we discuss this, we will see the conclusion with an analysis of what the two sides represented and their irreconcilable difference, which, as I read earlier in our written report, was settled by the U.S. imposition of its colonial policy on church-state separation, a process that brought to the fore some legacies of the contending ideas in Malolos. When the Malolos Congress returned to the issue of the state and religion in late of November 1899, a vigorous debate did ensue. Deploying his oratorical skills continuously for 5 hours, Tomas del Rosario explained his opposition to the unity of church and state. In the afternoon of the same day, Manuel Gomez spoke on behalf of the unity of church and state. The following day, Arcadio del Rosario, with a patent erudition, took his turn to defend the necessity of religious freedom. Subsequently, Calderon, also a polished orator, spoke to elucidate the reasons for his position on church-state unity. On November 24, Calderon continued his presentation, but a number of interruptions by Thomas del Rosario were recorded. In the heat of these exchanges, according to Teodoro Agoncillo, I quote, one group hurled changes and the counter-charges against the other. Thus, the Calderon group was accused of being the stooges of the friars. More More cutting was the indictment that the men carrying the burden of defending the state religion were traitors to the cause of revolution. End quote. The lead separationist Thomas del Rosario, for instance, emphasized that, I quote him, Christianity was the best of all religions if it had not been altered by human passions. He said that with the doctrines of Christianity, it would have been possible to establish the universal republic, but religious intolerance had made it possible. This statement sought to differentiate true Christianity in theory and in practice. In fact, Thomas del Rosario stressed that in the Philippines, the true Catholic religion has never been preached and the teachings of Jesus Christ have been prostituted. As a result, what he called the feudalismo theocratico or theocratic feudalism characterized our present religion. In response, Manuel Gomez argued that Catholicism was the most perfect religion into which the Filipino people had been born, and that even though its ministers had prostituted their calling, it did not, according to him, divest the Catholic religion of its superior worth, pointing instead to the need to distinguish human frailties from the tenets of the faith itself. Aware of sensitivities among Congress delegates, Thomas del Rosario stood to clarify that he did not in the least intend to impugn Catholicism, even going to the extent of claiming that it was also his religion. The separationists thus focused their criticisms not on religion itself, but on the faults of its ministers, reminiscent of the conventional propagandist's line. Manuel Gomez argued that Catholic priests, although subject to all vices and passions, nonetheless sought the good of humanity. Besides, he argued, no nation could boast of having its members rigorously complying with all its precepts and mandates. Gomez also ruminated that with the union of the church and state, the evil in humanity would be restrained by two coercive forces, the internal the internal force through religion and the external force through the state. However, in questioning the value of Catholicism as a state religion, Arcadio de Rosario Reposti highlighted that comparative statistics on crime in countries with and without a state religion did not support the idea that a state religion made any difference in reigning in human passions. Indeed, the consensus among the native elite was that the friars themselves did not transcend their human passions. And apart from their personal morality, the friars were widely decried for interference in even usurpation of the affairs of the state. But the advocates of state religion emphasized that with the friars austere, the native clergy would take over the Philippine church and would prove to be unlike the Spanish friars. Because of their tested patriotism, Filipino priests would not usurp governmental powers. As far as the separationists were concerned, however, The religious minister's nationality was not a consideration. In advancing the first of 12 reasons why state religion was not acceptable, Arcadio de Rosario sounded a warning even about the native clergy. He said, I quote, "The ministers of a religion protected by the state usually begin the exercise of their ministries as self-sacrificing martyrs, but end as tyrants and executioners, or honest words, verdugos." This blanket portrayal of church ministers demanded the ability to step back from one's patriotism as a Filipino. But for an advocate of church-state unity, it was not easy to countenance this radically different perspective. For each argument in this debate, a counter-argument was easily found, even when the critical gaze shifted from Catholicism to its ministers. On the basis of argumentation alone, it was an apparent stalemate. What is more, for the protagonists, the question of church-state relations was profoundly emotional. As Thomas Rosario acknowledged at the outset, I quote, "It was with aversion that he would speak, since the religious question is linked with highly venerated memories and all the legends with which we were rocked from our cradle." Perhaps to create emotional distance, the separationists highlighted not local history, but European history, which they presented as a pivoting around the papacy. They trained their intellectual armaments against papal power, even if under Spain the Vatican did not govern the Philippine Church directly, but through the Spanish monarchy in the form of the Patronato Real. And the exchange that saw Calderon defending the native clergy's patriotism as the source of confidence for their non-usurpation of state power. Arcadio del Rosario countered. He said, "Not the clergy, but the papacy." As the main proponent of the separation of church and state, Thomas del Rosario argued on the basis of a profound historical distrust of the papacy, which harked back to Del Pilar's 1889 statement about the need to weaken the Pope. In his defense of separation, Thomas del Rosario presented his own take on European history to stress the long struggle of the state to free itself from the clutches of Rome, which had created a state within a state, a social formation in which ecclesiastical power overwhelmed the state and acted despotically. He explained the Crusades as impelled by a religious fanaticism, and they discoursed on the policy that proclaimed the papacy as ruler of the world, or dueño del mundo, and the conquest of the Andes. He went on to discuss the Reformation and the monarch's claim to their divine origin to counteract the power of the Roman pontiff. He analyzed the consequences of the Reformation, which he said annihilated the Roman Church and proclaimed the liberty of the human conscience. He discussed the the policies of Cardinal Reggio, who emancipated the state from ecclesiastical control and whose diplomacy was continued by Mazarin until religious liberty and equality of all religions had been achieved. He then reviewed the Congress of Westphalia and discussed the independence of the state from ecclesiastical tutelage. Thomas del Rosario's recounting of European history overdrew the Vatican's power and underemphasized the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte. But his point was to suggest that the newly independent Philippines should seize the opportunity brought about by the struggles and wars in Europe that had liberated the state from Roman control. To advocate the contrary was regressive, a return to the medieval ages, supporting the view that church-state unity was repugnant was Arcadio de Rosario's proposition that papal power in countries without religious freedom always resulted in intervention and civil power with disastrous results. The Philippines should not think it could restrain the Vatican, for he pointed that France had not been able to diminish or weaken the power of the Pope despite many concordants. It was also Arcadio de Rosario who pointed out that in the United States, where religious freedom had reigned for over 100 years, the Catholic Church was flourishing. In contrast, he attributed the decadence of Spain primarily to the denial of religious freedom and the subsequent preponderance of the clergy. Thomas de Rosario devoted nearly 5 hours of expostulations on European history, which to him was the basis for the necessity of church-state separation. Conspicuously absent was Philippine history. Although fully aware of his own country's past, Tomas de Rosario opted not to make any reference to the secularization movement and the martyrdom of Burgos, Gomez, and Zamora. The separationists keep their distance from an issue of vast subjective importance. To members of the native elite, many of them were related by kinship to native priests. When he finally mentioned the Philippine situation, Thomas de Rosario took the perspective of non-Catholics, focusing on Muslims in Mindanao and Dolo and the distinct beliefs professed by the inhabitants of the Philippine archipelago, for whom he said privileging the Catholic Church as a state religion would be unjust and would bring about some serious conflicts and provoke a civil war. Similarly, Arcadio de Rosario spoke of the genuine tolerance that prevailed in the Philippines, which should not be reversed by adopting a state religion. This line of reasoning recalled Del Pilar's criticism of the decree on Rizal's deportation to Mindanao, which, I quote, "We maintain that the Philippines is composed of people with heterogeneous religion, that to hold the theory that Catholicism is the rational tie in the Philippines is to exclude from Spain's community the non-Catholic groups, those who are not even Christians, and above all, the polytheists." Members of the Filipino clergy attended the sessions of the Revolutionary Congress, eagerly participating as spectators and lobbyists. According to Majol, many Filipino priests interested in the outcome of the discussions were seen occupying seats reserved for the guests. They were disappointed by the turnout. The lone Catholic priest who was a member of the Revolutionary Congress, Gregorio Aglipay, tried to have the amendment suspended and apparently was instrumental in persuading Mabini to do just that. Earlier on October of 22, 1898, Aglipay, whom Aguinaldo had appointed Vicario General Castrense, had issued a circular to the Filipino clergy to indicate that the intention of the revolutionary government was to, I quote, "preserve the Catholic religion in all its purity," or and presumed dominance, thus meriting the clergy's recognition and cooperation. Their non-cooperation could impel the revolutionary government to adopt the separation of church and state, which in Aglipai's view would, I quote, gravely prejudice the interests of the clergy and above all the service of religion. The turn of events in Malolos was probably beyond Aglipai's expectation, for had it been, he would have endeavored to be present and influence the vote. As it turned out, he was away on official business when the vote was taken. After the triumph of the principle of separation, a number of Filipino priests petitioned Aguinaldo to preserve the Catholic Church position and veto the Congress decision. In a memorial, Father Mariano Garces argued that religion, as the source of morality, was the basis of society and government. In the Philippines, it had to be Catholicism because it was the religion of the majority of Filipinos. He stated that the separation of church and state was one of the errors of liberalism and condemned by the popes. Moreover, religious liberty meant that people could think of God in whatever way they wanted, giving rise to error and impiety. Garcia concluded that the triumph of the revolution was God's handiwork. Therefore, people had to be grateful and demonstrate this gratitude by safeguarding the Catholic Church as the state religion and prohibiting other religions. The vexations caused by the approval of the provision on the church-state separation were so grave that Mabini, who personally advocated this principle, was compelled to seek its suspension. As Calderon put it, I quote, "The religion problem was of such tremendous implications that Mabini himself, a first sectarian and a Mason with serious commitments, did not dare to accept." The principle, as presented and approved by the Revolutionary Congress. While the debate in Malolos was going on, Mabini had warned Aguinaldo about the fallout that could destabilize the revolutionary government. He said, I quote, "There is now going on in Congress a heated discussion on the religious question. If you favor one faction, then the other will separate itself from the government. It is imperative that you commission a secretary to inform Congress that unless the times become normal, such problems should not be discussed. This is a warning of what may happen in the future." In the future. Indeed, the revolutionary government had thought it necessary to obtain the cooperation of the native clergy, rallying the support of the masses, akin to the way the Spanish colonial state relied on friars to prop up the role of Spain in the islands. Earlier on July 26, 1898, Aguinaldo had ordered local officials, I quote, to call upon the patriotism of all Filipino clergy, to impress upon their parishioners that in order that our independence should be secured, it is necessary to give absolute adhesion to the revolutionary government and its worthy president. With this apprehension, after the triumph of church-state separation, Mabini as Prime Minister addressed a memorandum to the Council of State in mid-December of 1898 declaring, I quote, "The voting in Congress is inadmissible at this time for two reasons. One, because it is not possible to sustain for now the constitutional guarantees that have been provided to establish individual liberties precisely at this time when military dominance is necessary. And two, because in these difficult times it would be appropriate to establish openly the separation of church and state, causing the withdrawal of those who support the state religion. Given the exigency of the moment, Aguinaldo would not risk alienating the Filipino clergy and their supporters. Yet he could also not veto the approved provision on church-state separation. To stem the tide of disaffection, Aguinaldo adopted Mabini's proposal, convened to the Assembly on New Year's Day of 1899, to postpone the implementation of Title III, Article 5, I quote, until the official recognition of our independence. Meanwhile, the status quo would prevail, with the municipality concerned providing for the maintenance of the local priest. This evasive technique was adopted into one of the Constitution's transitory provisions. It was astute of Aguinaldo not to court disaster by offending the clergy. Although many native priests supported the revolution, many members of the native clergy also remained loyal to Nozaleda, which I quote, compelled to satisfy the demands of conscience and fidelity to the church if they were not to cut themselves off from the whole meaning of their calling as priests. For their part, Aglipay supporters did not convene to establish a national church until a year later in Paniqui, Tarlac. The Paniqui Assembly declared itself independent of the Spanish ecclesiastical hierarchy, confirmed allegiance to the Rome, and vowed it would not accept any foreign bishop unless approved by native priests in a plebiscite. On April 29 of 1899, Aglipay was sentenced by a tribunal created by Nosaleda, but this move was publicized only on May 4, when the revolutionary government was in retreat. He was excommunicated for, I quote, usurpation of authority, making the ecclesiastical appointments while only an army chaplain, answering functions of a prelate by virtue of a civil appointment, and ordering Filipino clergy not to obey their Spanish superiors. Nevertheless, the revolutionary government continued to support Aglipay, who remained one of its officials. Mabini even assisting Aglipay write his defense. Aglipay's own position, along with the Filipinization of the Catholic Church, was undermined by the approval of the separation of church and state in the Malolos Congress. Still, the actions of Aguinaldo and Mabini, particularly in appointing Aglipay, indicated a determination to ignore the outcome of the vote in Malolos. Although for a while some lower officials might have prevaricated on this issue or were determinedly moderate, the actions of the top leadership of the revolutionary government fitted the model of a state religion, with the civil government exercising appointive authority in the church. At the extreme, many local government officials harassed native parish priests and, I quote, interfered with the religion practices of the inhabitants. Although Aguinaldo sought to curb abuses and safeguard the rights of the clergy, these contradictions underscored the politics, tensions, and pragmatics of attempting to build the state in the throes of war and revolution. Amid the chaos, the revolutionary government did in fact operate on the basis of church-state unity, a vindication of Calderon's position.